We're moving now to our fourth session. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Shwetlena Sabarwal. Her presentation is titled The World Bank's Human Capital Index and the Importance of Metrics for Policy and Research. So Dr. Shwetlena is a senior economist at the World Bank, at the Education Global Practice World Bank. She was a principal author for the World Development Report 2019 on the changing nature of work. World Development Report 2018 on learning to realize education's promise, and World Bank's education policy guidance for COVID-19. She has published in leading journals in the areas of education, economics, and labor markets. In education, her research is on effort, mindsets, and incentives within education systems. In labor markets, her work has focused on entrepreneurship, gender, and networks. Shwetlena has led World Bank's education engagement in Uganda, Tanzania, Bangladesh, and Nepal. She holds a PhD in applied economics from University of Minnesota. Dr. Shwetlena.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm really looking forward to discussing this with you, the audience, and also with the other esteemed panelists. So I'm actually going to talk more about some insights we've had in our work on how assessments can drive policy, better policy. So let's get into it. So I think the biggest insight, the most radical insight that we've had in the last few years on education is that when it comes to economic growth or economic development, it's not so much schooling that matters, it's actual learning, right? So learning outcomes are a much better predictor of economic growth and economic development than just years of schooling. Right? And the fact that we see this difference shows that just schooling does not always guarantee learning, right? And following from this, I think there has been in the last 2 decades much more emphasis on learning, which we were perhaps missing before this. And that emphasis on learning has led us to realize that learning outcomes are actually really low globally. And this is something that Sylvia also alluded to, and the work that UNESCO has done on this has been really instrumental, and also the work that is being done by OECD and other organizations. So we see that when you look at both learning and schooling, right, not just years of schooling, you see that globally we have a lot of disparities, and they unfortunately seem to be regionally focused somewhat, right? And when you look at globally comparable learning data, you find some quite sort of depressing numbers. So you see, for instance, that a grade 8 student, okay, will know very different, will be at very different levels of proficiencies depending on where in the world he or she is, right? So the same grade, grade 8, will have different levels of proficiencies depending on which country you're in. And in some countries, a grade 8 student knows very little in terms of proficiency compared to students in the same grade in other countries. And this sort of difference is really startling, right? And we know this difference because we have looked at learning assessment data and we have compared learning assessment data across countries. Now, this in some sense is a static picture. And you could argue that now that we have this insight that learning is so important, are we making progress? Are we really changing things? Now, again, fortunately, the work done by OECD, for instance, allows us to compare learning outcome over time, right? Now, this is, again, still very imperfect, but you could, for instance, ask yourself that at the current rate of progress, how long would it take a country to go from low proficiency to high proficiency, right? So how long, for instance, would it take Indonesia, which by all accounts, is not doing very badly in education, how long will it take Indonesia to reach the proficiency levels of an average OECD country, right? So an average developed country in Europe or North America. And when you do that, you actually find that the numbers are not great, right? So you see that it will take Indonesia at the current rate of change about 48 years to achieve the same proficiency level that an average OECD country has, and 74 in math and 74 years for reading, right? So not only is the static picture really depressing in some ways, the dynamic picture is also really concerning, right? So we are not making improvements at the rate that we need to make improvements. And this again echoes, I think, one of the figures that Sylvia showed earlier about how much better we need to do to close learning gaps by 2030, which is the SDG target, and how poorly we are doing, relatively speaking. So then the question is, why is it that countries have spent so much money, so much energy, so much political commitment on education, and yet we have so little to show for it in terms of learning? And one argument that you can make is that the reason learning levels are relatively low and much behind the access levels is partly because learning has so far been very invisible, right? So we haven't really, historically speaking, spent as much time measuring learning, spent as much resources measuring learning as we should have done, right? So you can again see this when you ask, which countries have robust national assessment data. Now here I'm not talking about global benchmark data. I'm just talking about national assessment data. And you would see that there are still many countries in different parts of the world who don't have national assessment data that can be really used for policy. And this gap is even bigger post-primary, right? So countries are more likely to have some assessment data at the primary level, but then less likely to have assessment data post-primary. And this really makes a difference, right? This makes learning invisible. And when learning is invisible, then you don't get the same attention, the same resources, the same political pressure, the same technical innovation in this area that you would have done if learning measures were available, right? So I'll show you this using a very simple example, okay? So in Africa, so we looked at 3 countries in East Africa, and there was these assessments done to look at the achievement level among grade 4 students, right? So grade 4 students were given a grade 2 math test, okay? A grade 2 math test. And you see that many grade 4 students could not pass a grade 2 math test. And this number is really terrible in places like Tanzania and Uganda, where only 21% or 26% of grade 4 students were able to pass a grade 2 math test, right? So when you look at a number like this, you would say, oh, there's a lot that needs to be done to improve education. But then when you ask parents if they are satisfied with education quality, you see that most parents are satisfied, right? And this is the gap that I'm talking about. Parents are satisfied because they don't know that learning is so low. And they don't know that learning is so low because the learning measurement has not been done and has not been reported and disseminated. So it sort of creates this lack of information, and then that translates into lack of accountability within the system, lack of pressure within the system to improve learning. So we need to make learning visible, right? And the way to make learning visible is to have good, useful, over time learning measures. And there are 3 or 4 things that learning measures can do that make a huge difference in how education systems operate. So the first thing that they do is that learning measurement creates a culture of transparency and accountability within the education system. Now, in order to think about it, for accountability, we also need to be able to communicate the gaps in learning in a sort of really understandable way to the general public, to also to the policymakers, right? We cannot always be talking in very complicated technical language. We have to have a language for learning that is easily accessible for everybody. So some work that I have been involved in is this work on learning adjusted years of schooling. So the idea here is that we look at the years of schooling, which are very widely reported. And UNESCO actually reports the expected years of schooling for nearly all countries. And then you adjust those years of schooling for the quality of schooling, right? So this is related to the example that I showed you earlier, that how much is a year of schooling getting you in terms of actual learning, right? And when you do that exercise, when you adjust the years of schooling for learning, you see that you can actually quantify the gap, right? Especially when you compare this with the most high performing countries, right? So a year of schooling is getting you some level of skills in Switzerland or in Sweden, and they're not getting you the same level of skills elsewhere. So that kind of gap can be quantified, and you can see the gap to the frontier in the orange part of the bars. And that actually gives a framework, that gives a very easy language for policymakers, but also for the general public to understand how much more needs to be done and to track progress, right? So create accountability, but also create a sense of progress and a sense of improvement and change. So we think that this tool can sort of really help make learning visible, right? And this has then been used in the World Bank's Human Capital Index. So I'm not going to go into that, but Human Capital Index sort of looks at health and education and combines health and education measures to see how much is the country doing in terms of using its health and education systems to improve the productivity of future generations. And it gives you, again, a sense from the frontier, how far is the country from the frontier. But for the education part of the Human Capital Index, the learning adjusted years of schooling are the main ingredient. The other thing that metrics can do, learning measurement can do, is that it can reveal the inequalities within the system, right? So it's not just important to think about how is the average child doing or how is the system on the whole. It's also important to look within the system and see who is lagging behind, right? And learning measurement work that has been done has been really instrumental in seeing how some countries could be doing better, but are much more unequal within, right? So for instance, here I show how PISA data can be used to see how much inequality there is within the system and how different systems should be evaluated and should be held accountable, not just to have high levels of learning, but to have high levels of learning for all, have low inequality. And this concern is even more heightened with COVID-19, as you can imagine. Now, the final point that I want to make here is the very latest work that I've been involved in, which is to say, can we also then use learning measurement much more directly for policy making and for guiding policy investments, right? So here, what we've done is we have so much more information now from evaluations of education interventions. Now, as you can imagine, every government has limited resources, but then they have so many different types of investments that they can make, so many different types of policies and interventions that they can do. So how to decide what to do? Now, we can then use learning measures much more proactively to guide that decision making. So here what we are doing is we are looking at 150 education interventions that have good evaluation data, and we are translating the education impacts in terms of learning adjusted years of schooling gained, right? So then we can compare different interventions on a standardized metric and say, how many years of schooling, learning adjusted years of schooling, right? So learning quality years of schooling do you get through this investment, right? And using that metric, you can compare different investments. And you can do this even more effectively, go a step further and compare different interventions on cost effectiveness. So not just effectiveness, but cost effectiveness. So how much more learning adjusted years of schooling are you getting through a particular intervention per dollar spent, right? Now, I want to echo Paul here. Paul had just mentioned that we also have to be careful when we use measurement in this way, because we cannot be simplistic about it. We have to, this is just one ingredient. This is just one guide. We have to then look at this guide in context. We have to contextualize it with local factors. We have to take into consideration many, many other things like feasibility, context, political acceptability, and so on. So this is not to say that we should just use this one thing to guide all education investments, but it can be a very useful tool to be in the mix, right? So a really quantitative, measurement-driven information point that governments can use when they're deciding where to spend their money. So in summary, in order to improve economic growth and economic development, we have to improve learning. There's no other way. And in order to improve learning, we have to make learning visible. It has to be visible to people. It has to be visible to policymakers. And that is where learning measurement is a really, really important tool. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shwetlena. Early in your presentation, you depicted a very depressing piece of information. It would take Indonesia half a century to catch up with average developed countries in OECD. So what should we do?
So yeah, no, it is depressing, but I think the first step to solving the problem is to know that there is a problem, and is to measure the extent of the problem. And that is, I think, what we are doing increasingly well. And conferences like this, discussions with policymakers like this are a great step. Now, what a country needs to do, I think, has to be driven by not just learning measurement information, but then also a better understanding of contextual features. And here I mentioned some of them. So one is to understand inequality within the system, right? So is it that the average child is doing poorly, or is it that there are a huge inequalities and disparities within the system? And then we have to look at the causes, right? So in World Bank's World Development Report 2018, we really discuss how countries can start solving the problem of the learning crisis. And here, we have to look at two layers. The first layer will be the education system layer. And here you have four ingredients. You have the school inputs, you have the teachers, you have the early childhood investment. So how prepared are children to learn? And finally, you have system level factors. So you have to look at each of those factors, see what the country is doing, see where it's lacking, and also see the global evidence on what are the best ways to prepare teachers, what are the best ways to prepare head teachers, and so on. But then I think a lot of times what World Development Report shows that it goes a level deeper than that also, which is that you have to look at whether the system is aligned towards learning, right? So all education systems have so many different parts. And sometimes what happens is that these complicated, different small parts start to work for their own goals, which are smaller, right? And they're not aligned together. So is your curriculum subsystem and your teacher training subsystem and your student assessment subsystem, are they all aligned? Are they talking to each other? Are they all aligned to the same goal of learning? So I think countries also have to do a lot of thinking at that level. So those would be my big recommendations, which are threefold. Look at where learning is falling short, right? So really analyze your learning assessment data. Then look at your education systems and look at the four important parts of the education system. And then go one layer deeper and look at the alignment of the different subsets within the education and broader system. Thanks.
Sure. Another follow-up question. Also, I noticed you mentioned that in one of the charts that you showed is that some African countries have very low learning adjusted years of school. Is this really because that the education output is not of a high quality, or is that because of, for instance, lack of data? So data is not there, so we were not able to measure an actual or an accurate number.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think for sub-Saharan Africa specifically, the first thing we have to realize is that sub-Saharan Africa is one area where still years of schooling, so just access to schooling is still low, right? So there are millions of children who are still out of school. So when you look at the learning adjusted years of schooling, they're both ingredients are low, right? So learning is low, but so are years of schooling also low, right? So Africa has to make improvements on both dimensions. Whereas in contrast, if you think about Latin America or you think about Middle East and North Africa, their years of schooling are quite high. Learning is where they need to improve. So with Africa, it's both. And then in terms of why learning is low, certainly learning measurement is below par. There much more needs to be done to measure learning. But I also think that it's the combination of a lack of resources as well, right? So their systems are still struggling with having adequate amounts of inputs. And then there are also some system level factors with accountability and incentives and so on.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Shwetlena.